Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Delayed Redemption by Kel O'Connor, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Janey exited her apartment in a buoyant mood. The Virginia sky was cloudless, the temperatures bearable, and she was on vacation. Her plans included visiting a botanical garden and shopping at the nearby farmer's market. As always, she was prepared. A water bottle, light clothing, a sun hat, and a coating of sunscreen, just in case. The complex was quiet, not surprising for 7 a.m. on a Saturday. Many of her neighbors worked in bars and restaurants where late nights were the norm. The bright sun hit her eyes, and she blinked rapidly to adjust her vision. Crap. She'd left her sunglasses in the car again. She'd have to squint for now. Her backpack made a thump as it landed on the concrete walkway. She turned to lock the door, but noise to her right clued her in that she wasn't alone. Hair stood up on her nape. Her first instinct was to run back inside. The cowardly reflex infuriated her, reminding her how hard she'd labored to stifle such timidness. She was no longer a little bird, but a grown woman in charge of her own life. Probably a squirrel or a stray cat, she told herself. Nothing out of the ordinary. She forced her muscles to turn her head, a slight move that seemed to take hours. The air in her lungs whooshed out at the minor triumph. It was definitely a person. Squirrels don't wear hoodies. Anxiety kicked back in, leaving her frozen for a few seconds. So much for bravery. Her initial instinct had been correct. Flee. Before turning to hasten back inside, she saw the hint of red on the person's almost shaved head. Damn it. She swayed on her feet, feeling her stomach drop. Her fright shifted to wariness. Of course, it couldn't be a random homeless person curled up in the corner. It was her brother. Janey would have preferred a serial killer, a werewolf, anyone but Scott. She lived in a converted hotel. The bottom porch ran past all 4 units on the first floor. Gray concrete was set off by the pale green railing, the same shade as at the front doors, and the window trim of the building. Her lips thinned when she saw how he had carelessly toppled over one of her flower pots in order to squeeze into the corner space. The petunias would survive. At least he hadn't crushed them. She sighed, her planned day of fun disappearing down the toilet. She eyed the lump of denim and camo coiled into the corner. How had he slept so contorted? He had likely been high and was now coming down from it. What was he doing here? Their only other relative, their father, had been dead 5 years, so they had no reason to be in touch. How had he found her? She'd moved since their last contact. He still snored. Her stomach cramped, tension already taking hold. Scott was bad news. He'd joined a drug gang in his teens. After she left home for college, she'd only seen him once, at their father's funeral. By then, he had worked his way up in the gang to where he had paid for the funeral without batting an eye, and she had let him. They had gone their separate ways right after. She peered up and down the parking lot, but did not see an unfamiliar vehicle. How had he gotten here, and why hadn't he rang the doorbell? Had he really passed out before he could knock? She bent down until the rough concrete scraped her knees. She dressed in a t-shirt and cut-off shorts, perfect attire for a free day with no demands. So much for her plan, she thought as acid filled her throat. As much as she loathed to touch him, she reached out and shook his shoulder under the threadbare jacket. Was he slumming? He'd been in Armani at the funeral. She only knew because he'd mentioned it several times. She didn't know Armani from Men's Warehouse. The odor coming off of him was strong, dried sweat mixed with booze and urine. How long had he been living like this? Maybe he wasn't slumming. Maybe he had hit bottom. What caused the abrupt change of fortune? Even though he was active in drug running, she'd never seen signs he was an addict. A dabbler, yes, but not a habitual user. Even at the funeral, he'd appeared sober. The pile snorted, and bloodshot brown eyes snapped open. One hand flew to his coat pocket, and she half expected him to pull out a knife or gun. Fear had her rising to her feet and taking a step back. He kept his hand in the pocket, so it must be a weapon. She swallowed back the bile and breakfast granola threatening to come up her throat. How fast could she get back inside? Not fast enough. Her cell was in her back pocket. She could call the police. No, her hands were shaking too badly. She dropped the phone. Her debate waged on as he pulled himself up to a sitting position and groaned. Not gonna shoot you, he grumbled, and finally showed both hands as he rubbed them over his face. He took his time rising to his feet, clumsy from sleep or whatever he might be on. An oversized camo jacket dwarfed his average frame, leaving only the bottom half of dirty jeans showing. She stepped back farther, her heart thumping in her ears. If only she still had the backpack in her hands, she could throw it at him. It might put him off balance enough to give her time to get inside. She might be able to outrun him, make it inside, but her frantic mind could not pick an option. It was stuck in panic mode. How did he find me? Gritting her teeth, she took a deep breath. Scott had not physically harmed her in years, had not even touched her at their father's funeral. Today, he was different. Gone were the dark hair dye, the swagger, and fancy suit. She had 1,000 questions, but didn't speak. Had he been on some sort of binge? His athletic shoes were muddy and one lace was frayed, but he appeared sober to her surprise. I need money. You owe me. Owe you for what? She gasped, outraged and clueless. Her ire muffled her fear a bit. All her life, she'd worked hard not to be in his debt for anything. She knew better. Any help he gave, he expected twice as much in return. Dad's funeral. You insisted on paying for it, she urged, vividly remembering the tricked out casket he'd chosen. It had been garish, not something their simple pop would have wanted. I don't have time to play, Janey, he shouted and took a step toward her. I need cash. He was only a few inches taller than she was, but he radiated menace and desperation, which made her even more on guard, especially when his hand moved back to his pocket. How much? She asked, holding up her hands, hoping they didn't shake too much. He rolled his eyes at the gesture. 1,000. I don't have that kind of money, she protested, but kept her tone even so as not to stoke his fury higher. How much do you have? He snarled, making her take another step backward. 300, she told him reluctantly. If she gave him the money, maybe he would leave. I can give you all of it. Stay here. She slid back inside and leaned against the locked door, taking deep breaths. She could call 911 and have him picked up. Surely he was violating parole or evading arrest. Some emotion she had squashed down years ago flared, and she knew she wouldn't. Not because of any affection she owed a blood relative. He would retaliate, which was his way. Growing up, she'd stopped tattling on him at a young age. He rarely used physical violence. His revenge had been to destroy what she loved: toys, books, and later, her plants. He was not the type to let a perceived infraction go unpaid. Now he had access to all sorts of weapons thanks to his gang involvement. Best to give him the money and pray it was the last time she saw him. When her knees stopped shaking, she walked into the small kitchen and opened the freezer. On the bottom shelf was a box of pizza rolls. Stashed inside, along with her food, was her emergency cash. It was a habit left over from when she had worked in her teens. She'd hidden her earnings from Scott and Pop. How ironic Scott was here now, taking it. She could replace it out of her checking account, but that wasn't the point. She reluctantly returned outside, quickly locking the door behind her. She did not want him inside her haven. She handed him the bills, happy when their hands didn't touch. He had the gall to chuckle. Wondered if you'd become a hard ass over the years. Guess not. His accent was still the same one she'd fought hard to correct in herself. 100% Boston. Hard ass came out hot ass. Please leave me alone, Scott. She forced her voice to sound strong, but she heard the quaver. Don't come back. He laughed without humor and stepped onto the sidewalk. Like I'd want to hang around you again, puta. She waited as he hurried down the walk and around the building. He headed in the highway's direction. Maybe he'd left a car there. While she wanted to run back in and hide, Janey forced herself to pick up her backpack and continue with her day. But she locked the doors the second she was safely inside her car. The vanilla air freshener filled her nose as she welcomed the heat from the enclosed space. She was freezing, probably from shock. She started the car but sat there until the shaking ceased. Only then did she back out of the parking space. She had 2 weeks off in between leaving her old job and starting her new one. She'd planned on spending 3 days here at home and then leaving to visit her friend Zoe in DC. They had been paired as freshman roommates and bonded instantly. When Zoe's family found out Janey couldn't afford to go home for the holidays or the summer, they'd unofficially adopted her. She wouldn't have made the trip even if money was no object. She preferred to stay as far away from her childhood as she could. By the time she left the market, she had almost convinced herself the morning's fright had been a dream. Almost. She shoved the encounter with her brother deep into her subconscious. She'd be damned if Scott ruined her entire day. He was gone, hopefully for good. She refused to dwell on it, hating the nausea that filled her whenever his name crossed her mind. Concentrate on the positives, she told herself. She'd successfully sent her brother away without breaking down. Her best life yet was only days away with her new dream job. The dream job was finally hers. Yes, she would be low on the team, but it was an incredible chance to build something thousands of people would see. Her buoyant mood remained when she returned home. There was no sign of Scott outside her apartment door. No strange vehicles in the parking area, just a maintenance van. 2 workers were reloading paint cans and chatting. As she headed to her apartment, she felt them follow her. Don't be silly, she admonished her racing heart. She was paranoid after the encounter with Scott. Silly. It was broad daylight, after all. Still, gripping her keys in her hand, she quickened her pace. Suddenly, a rough hand on her upper arm twirled her around. She took in a breath to scream as the second man plunged a needle into her bicep. Darkness closed out the bright sunlight before she could finish her inhale. When Janey came to, all was darkness. She was lying on her left side. The floor bounced and creaked. She was in a vehicle. Once a police safety officer had come to her high school. He'd been a big, burly man with a thin mustache. Despite his looks, his talk had been both humorous and frightening. He'd warned them, if you're taken from a public place, make as much noise as possible. Also, don't let yourself be taken to a different location. Panic swept up her throat, making her want to gag. Too late for those helpful hints. What else had the cop said? Stay calm. Feel around your environment. There was a loose fabric bag over her head. It was rough on her cheek. She obviously wasn't alone, so she assumed it would be better to pretend to still be unconscious. She tried flexing her hands and found they were bound together in front of her. She dared to move her fingers and felt carpeting. She could hear faint road noise as well as rap music turned low. All she could smell was must and dust from the bag. Either it was nighttime or she was in a trunk or in the back of a van. She could not see any light through the loose weave of whatever was on her head. Breathe. Passing out would not help, she told herself. She closed her eyes and counted to 10, taking deep breaths. Slowly, she pulled herself into a tight ball, anchoring her bound hands between her knees. It didn't help the boulder in her stomach, but her panic lessened. Utter terror threatened to break her, but if she cried, it would let whoever know she was awake. She took additional deep breaths in and out, hoping to calm her nerves. What was happening to her? Scott. The answer came on a bolt of awareness. It could not be a coincidence this happened the same day he showed up. Dear God, what had he fallen into? Why had he dragged her into it? If this was the gang he'd ran with, they were trouble. Serious trouble. Oh, no. She repeated the breathing exercise, vowing not to throw up, no matter how much her stomach roiled like a hurricane. The muscles in her limbs shook from being held so tightly. She should decompress before drawing attention to herself. Easier said than done, she realized. Loosening up meant dwelling on why she was tied up inside a vehicle. It must go back to Scott's visit. Her stomach bottomed out. This could derail her new job. She could miss her start date. It would be hard for her new boss to believe she'd been kidnapped. It would also require telling him about her brother. Once again, Scott had tarnished her life with his selfishness. Or you could be killed. The idea of dying wasn't anything she wanted to focus on now. For her state of mind, she had to believe she would survive whatever this was. If they wanted her dead, they would have shot or stabbed her in the parking lot. Whatever this was, they wanted her alive. It wasn't that Janey was afraid. She was. Okay, screw it. She was terrified. But suddenly overriding her fear was white hot fury. How dare he? She had been oh so careful since leaving Boston, doing nothing that would tie her to her gangster brother, only venturing back for the funeral years ago. Yet somehow he had found her, messing up her life once again. Maybe for the last time, she thought with gloom. Murder was not taboo to the people Scott associated with, and there was little chance of Mateo coming to her rescue this time. Oh, Mateo. She tried to never think of him. It only made her heart sick. Was he even still alive? He'd been with the same gang as Scott, last she knew. From the time he'd saved her from her father, he'd become her teenage crush. She deliberately never looked him up, not wanting to know if he was dead or incarcerated. There was no way his good heart survived years with a gang. If he were still alive, he would be someone to fear, not wish for. No one will miss you. Her heart sank. She wasn't due in DC until next week to help her friend look for wedding gowns. She loved being around exuberant and happy Zoe, who made her feel normal, not like a scared kid from the slums. She had no plans with friends the next few days and did not have a job to report to this week. No rescue was coming. It was up to her. She strained to hear past the road noise. Finally, someone spoke, followed by a second person with a higher voice. Both were men. Her captors only communicated between themselves in heavily accented Spanish. Crap. Now it was more likely this had to do with Scott. The gang he joined as a teenager didn't discriminate on race, but many of them were from Puerto Rican families. Janey berated herself for not picking Spanish as her required college language course. Latin had been her choice since it related so heavily to horticulture. Plus, Spanish reminded her of Mateo's accent and how magical it had sounded when he spoke, which made her sad. Nevertheless, she could discern some words from her years in the neighborhood. They were either discussing soccer or food. Sick with dire thoughts, she shifted, hoping to get some fresh air under the hood. If she lived through this, she would definitely take a Spanish class online. A sharp pain hit her jaw, and she unclenched her teeth. Relax. As much as she wanted to scream and cry, fear and common sense kept her frozen. So much for all the work she'd done on being braver the past few years, she thought bitterly. She could not even remember one song on the girl power playlist she'd created. Terror gave a rank smell to her panic sweat, and she hated it. She'd never wanted to be that frightened girl again. Janey shuddered. Better to focus on the anger, shove the fear down until she could break down later in private. Okay, one last time. Mateo wanted to shout and pull on his too long hair in frustration, but Peter was his boss, and this was standard operating procedure at DAG. Instead, he folded his hands on the shiny tabletop, willing them to be still. The lighting in the conference room was dim, in deference to the early hour. The smell of Malachi's herbal tea was almost lost in the cool, recirculated air coming from the vents. As for this op, Mateo was pumped. He was ready. He'd waited years for this chance. He swallowed his frustration and answered, maintaining eye contact with Peter. As far as anyone in his old gang knew, he'd been locked in solitary for the last 2 months at a prison where he was serving a 12-year sentence. In reality, he'd been out doing small ops with DAG and preparing for this last undercover mission. Putting Saw and his gang out of commission and behind bars would help stem the drug trade on the East Coast. Dismantling the awful empire he himself helped build was all Mateo cared about. My lawyer secures my early release. Saul sends a car to pick me up at the prison. Once I'm back inside his compound, I make sure the intel we need is still in his safe. I play along until the raid happens. In 5 days, Peter interrupted. Yes, Mateo gritted his teeth. He memorized the plan backwards, forwards, and inside out. I spend the 5 days finding as much dirt as I can. When the DEA raid happens, I am publicly arrested along with everyone else. They confiscate the safe and the intel. I get sent back to prison where I'm accidentally killed in a staged fight. 4 cups of coffee and eye drops hopefully disguised the previous rough night. The nightmares were becoming more frequent, and last night's had been bad. Not a metaphorical dream, but something real from his past. The one person he hadn't meant to kill had even tried to save his first. Way back when he'd been an alley guard for the neighborhood drug dealer, Saw. At Saw's shout, Mateo had found him and the junkie with knives out, each one with superficial cuts. After getting the junkie's attention, he tried to disarm him while Saw stabbed him in the back. The man turned back to Saw, and Mateo stabbed the junkie in the thigh to slow him down, but not before receiving some nasty slashes on his arms. Being a high school dropout, he had no knowledge of the femoral artery. The amount of warm, thick blood pumping out as he tried to put pressure on the wound would never leave his memory. He'd shouted for Saw to run. Saw was older, and the worst they could do to Mateo was throw him in juvie. By the time he'd watched the man die in minutes, it was too late to flee. He did indeed end up in juvie, a short sentence because of the number of drugs in the junkie's system and Mateo's own defensive wounds, which pointed towards self-defense. His sacrifice had endeared him to Saw, who made sure Mateo rose along with him through the ranks. When his 3 months were up, he headed straight to a tattoo parlor. His guilt had him adding letters to his fingers, a constant reminder of what he was now, a tainted soul, a killer. It was funny. He'd never been burdened with much of a conscience over the years he'd been with the gang. They had become his family, and his job had been to protect them. He saw the responsibility as a privilege. The further away from them and the closer to his DAG team he moved, the worse the nightmares and the guilt became. But he welcomed it. He had much to atone for. After the nightmare, he'd showered until the hot water ran out, telling himself that soon, when he untangled himself from the gang, the nightmares would fade. With his new job at DAG, he would help people, getting guns and drugs off the streets, bringing down terrorists, and his dream life was finally within his reach. Until then, nightmares were a small penance. On his right, he saw Dell smirk and shake her head. She was his team leader. She knew how thrilled he was to see the end was in sight. Today, her usual suit was a subtle gray. Peter always wore a dark suit. Mateo came prepared, wearing a navy suit with a tie. He didn't want to appear underdressed, despite his long hair and tattoos. Dell added with a hand flourish. Then you are reborn as a free DAG agent. Not a minute too soon, Malachi said. I'm drowning in work after taking time off to teach the CIA class. I can't wait, Mateo responded fervently, smiling at his mentor. Malachi bucked the non-existent dress code. He was too much of a hippie and preferred nicer cardigans and jeans. Once Mateo had joined DAG, Malachi discovered his natural talent with computers. What a mindfuck the revelation had been. Other than using a tablet or cell phone, Mateo had had little knowledge of how technology worked. Now, he was better than anyone else on his team at hacking. How drastically his life had changed. Mateo had joined a drug gang in his teens. He'd had little choice. That or starve to death, live on the street. There he had found a brotherhood, even if some jobs had turned his stomach. He'd risen in the ranks, and the gang had morphed into its current massive form with Saw still the leader. With every passing year, Mateo saw new devastation from drugs and lost more pieces of his soul as he carried out Saw's commands. He'd survived 2 temporary prison stints by the time he came to his senses and defected to DAG. His undercover time with them had given him new friends, new skills, and a purpose. The owners, Peter, Daniel, and Malachi, were now role models he could truly look up to, even if they were ex-CIA agents and a hacker. One day, his new job could make up for all the death and destruction his former life had wrought. All he wanted now was for the gang part of his life to be over. He wanted his new bosses to find him worthy, which was a kick in the ass. He would profess he needed nothing and no one, but he knew it was a lie. The time with DAG had shown him he needed a purpose, something more noble than protecting a gang. He was beginning to admire this new Mateo. His late grandmother would approve of this man, the agent on the side of justice. The fact DAG skirted the law on behalf of the government to get their jobs done was simply a cherry on the sundae for someone like him who had lived without rules for so long. In order to fully be the man he wanted to be, he had one last mission of assuming his gang persona and going back. Did he have the will to do it and not relent? The gang was his family for so long. even if he'd grown to dislike that Mateo, the cobra. If he did not get out soon, the last authentic parts of himself would be gone. His future was so close, he could taste it.